Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to see people here. It's a pleasure to have people online. First of all, I would like, as is standard practice, to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and their elders, past, present, and emerging, and note that the land we're on has never been ceded. So it's a great pleasure this morning to introduce our speaker, Dr. Eloise Wright, and just say that the change in time, normally this would be a 4 o'clock in the afternoon seminar, and was a 4 o'clock in the afternoon seminar until only a few days ago, when the National Tertiary Education Union called a strike this afternoon. This is part of an industry action campaign at the ANU. So we've moved the seminar, we had to move the seminar to this morning. I apologize for any inconvenience that's caused for people, but there we are. So Eloise it's wonderful to welcome Eloise back to the ANU on this very cold wintry day, but fortunately, she knew what she was in for, having lived in Canberra for a number of years, so Canberra winters are no surprise. They may, however, be a bit of a shock since she has come indirectly from India, where Eloise is now working as an assistant professor in the Department of History at Ashoka University in
Sonipat.
Sonipat, thank you. Prior to that, Eloise had a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Michigan. Yeah. And did her PhD at Berkeley, but she was an extraordinary honors student for us here at the ANU before proceeding overseas. So it's always a pleasure to welcome our prodigal children back to the ANU. Eloise is speaking today on her pet topic, which is the southwest of China. Dali in the Ming, and we are waiting with bated breath to see where her research is taken. So Eloise, the floor is yours.
No worries. Yeah. Because since we have a small audience today, I'm going to do a little bit more interaction. So it will be helpful to be able to point at things. Okay. So thank you for coming this morning, and thank you for the kind introduction. Okay, so one of the major preoccupations of the historiography of China these days is about the question of Chineseness, right? Continuity of a Chinese identity or a Chinese state over a long historical period and into today. Was there a continuous China across dynasties and nation states? Was cultural unity a fundamental characteristic of these states? Were non-Chinese others, like Mongol or Manchu rulers, assimilated or Sinicized, or did they maintain distinctive non-Chinese identities or practices? The standard narrative of Chinese history assumes a level of identity, as in consistency, an identity of interest between Chinese states and Chinese culture over a long period of time. One way of telling a story of Chinese modernity is the idea that the common elite culture of the imperial state, grounded in the language of literary Chinese and in its classical literary tradition, became a mass culture by being identified with the nation state. Faced with a written tradition that emphasized homogeneity and a nation state invested in maintaining an image of historical unity, not least territorial unity, historians of pre-modern states have largely questioned this narrative by focusing on times when states understood as Chinese were ruled by foreigners, like the Mongol-Yuan dynasty and the Manchu Qing. On the other hand, the homogeneity of the governed population, especially under a so-called Chinese dynastic state like the Ming, has been much less frequently questioned. Of course, periods of expansion over the centuries meant that new territories were incorporated into the Chinese state, pacified by military colonies and settled by civilian migrants from central China. However, the most substantial research on difference in these contexts has used ethnic difference as the key framework within which to understand colonial or borderland societies. Moreover, when the newly established 1950s communist state developed its framework for determining what ethnicities existed within its territory, the original inhabitants of these regions were classified as ethnic minorities, 少数民族. Since then, those categories have set the terms for how pre-modern difference in those borderland regions, such as the one I studied, have been understood. So my way of approaching these problems has been via an in-depth local study of the city of Dali and its surrounding region. So you can see it here in the middle of the map, right? So Dali had been the capital of independent kingdoms from the 7th century when, okay, so here's a slightly closer view in on the area around Dali. So you can see it's sort of in between the Himalayan plateau and then following the rivers down into Peninsula Southeast Asia and into the ocean. So this area, although it's at the kind of western edge of what we think of as like the Chinese states of Eastern Eurasia, is also at a place that's very important for like trading crossroads, both up into Tibet and then south into the Bay of Bengal and then the Indian Ocean, as well as east and southeast. Okay, so if we zoom in a little bit, you can see the same kind of pattern of mountains going from in the northwest, yep, very high elevations down to the lower elevations, and you can see the rivers that are sort of going down in the same way. And then this kind of flattish plain in the middle is what's now northern Yunnan province. So Kunming is over here on the right near Diancang. Oops, it doesn't work. And then Arhai on the left is where Dali is. Okay, so this is zoomed in a little bit more again. And you can see again this kind of same north-south movement of rivers and mountain ridges, right? And the trading routes went again north-south up these long thin valleys, and then east over to Kunming. What's now Kunming? Okay, so Dali was so in the 6th century there were 6 Jiao. Jiao is a word that means kingdom in this period, in this place. Situated around in this kind of area around Arhai and Mt Diancang. And since it was unified in the 7th century as the Nanzhao kingdom, Dali was the capital of this kind of whole region. And then also over the following sort of 5 or 6 centuries under the Nanzhao and then the Dali kingdom, they ruled most of this area in this map and occasionally went up into Sichuan, and further south towards what's now Burma. Okay. So it was conquered by Mongol armies in 1253, and after that it became part of the Yuan and then the Ming empires. By the 15th century, okay, by the early 15th century, members of Dali elite families were beginning to give their sons the kind of classical education which enabled them to take part in the examination system and then take official service under the Ming. Because of Dali's position on the edge of the empire, many scholars have seen this as a straightforward narrative of Sinicization, right? Assimilation into the dominant culture. Others have looked at the texts that were produced by these Dali people and seen it as a form of resistance, right? Maintaining a distinct cultural heritage under colonialism. Both of these have some element of truth, but they are limited by firstly by using the modern framework of ethnicity as their primary category to analyze forms of difference, and secondly by focusing too strongly on like one aspect. By focusing very intensely on either assimilation or difference, they distort the overall picture of that's kind of mixed in the sources. Okay. So in my larger project, I argue that to understand changes in identities of individuals and groups over time, we need to think not just about change, but also about synchronous identities as complex, right? And including many different frameworks and aspects. So we don't have in change over time a simple movement from one identity to another, but like a change in emphasis or a change in way of thinking about some things that remain consistent. So even if we think about ourselves, right? Any one of us have multiple identities that will take on different, become more or less salient depending on the situation that we're in, right? In some situations, it matters a lot that I'm a woman. In other situations, it doesn't matter that much. So instead of trying to locate a cohesive group identity in the sources that can subsume all the aspects of individual identities, scholars in various disciplines can and do study what facets of identities are more salient in specific circumstances. The circumstances I'm going to be talking about today are death and burial. So in a historical context, when we're talking about written sources, these kind of interactions or situations in which a particular form of identity becomes more salient, if they occur repeatedly, they become typified in what we call genres, right? So the formal characteristics of the text develop kind of patterns that reflect the situations that the texts are written in, typically written in and used and circulated in, and the people that they're read by. So in this case, I'm talking about stone inscriptions written and carved as part of the funerary process, and then either sealed in the tomb or visible from outside. Okay, so first, in order to answer the question, why are these important? I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on the timeline. Okay, so 1253, we have the Mongol conquest of Dali. And then it's a little bit after that, you can see that the timelines of like the official kind of state-centric change of dynasty timelines don't match up with how things changed in Dali. So we've got multiple dates in here, right? The Mongols conquered Dali in 1253 and then established the Yuan dynasty after they conquered the southern Song in 1271. In 1368, the Ming dynasty was established in the northeast, but it's not established in Yunnan until 1383. In 1411, we get the first provincial graduates from Dali. There's like 3 of them. And then in 1412, we get the first one goes on to the metropolitan, success in the metropolitan examination. Okay, in 1490, from 1490 to about 1510, there's a lot of severe seismic activity in Yunnan, specifically in the northwest. It's obviously on the edge of the Himalaya. It's an area with a lot of tectonic plates. And this is a period when there were like a number of earthquakes, one after the other, that produced, it destroyed a lot of buildings. So people had to rebuild a lot. And so we have a lot of inscriptions from that period because people are rebuilding things frequently. Okay, from the 1540s to the 1570s. So we know that in the 16th century, if we're talking about the 16th century in sort of Sinophone cultures as a whole, we think a lot about the increase of printed material, right? And circulation of texts of different kinds. And we also get that in Dali. So we have not just an increase in the amount of printed material, but also in the amount of manuscripts that are, this includes like rediscovery of earlier texts and also new texts that are being written. There's a number of unofficial histories of like the Nanzhao kingdom that are compiled. There's like a number of different versions by a number of different authors that are circulated and then taken in, incorporated into other versions around this time. And another kind of genre that's being produced a lot around here and is gathering from different sources is gazetteers. So we're beginning to have literati from Dali writing gazetteers of Dali and also of Yunnan. Okay, 1675 is when the Yunnan becomes part of the Qing officially. And then I've also got this last, so the picture is the Dali City Museum, which was previously Du Wenxiu's house when he was the ruler of Dali. He was the in the middle of the 19th century after a period of repression of the Muslim population. There was a rebellion and led by Du Wenxiu, and he established his capital and again ruled the region from Dali as the center. And before that, it was the official, the yamen, right? The official center of Dali Prefecture, administrative office. But what we have now is, so you can see Diancang in the background, and then kind of here, these are the steles. The steles, some of the steles that I'll be talking about later have been collected here and then arranged around the courtyard, so you can go and look at them. Okay, so three kind of questions. First is what, okay, so we have a lot of sources from the 16th century, right? We have gazetteers, we have unofficial histories, we have inscriptions from institutions, and we also have inscriptions from funerary contexts. So a lot of our understandings about Dali and a lot of the secondary scholarship on Dali identity and sort of the stories that become part of the narrative of who are the Bai come from this period, right? We just have a lot more sources. And there definitely are some changes at that time in terms of the crystallization of a kind of local literati identity. But what we don't have as much information about is how that connects to what came before it, right? We know about the Nanzhao because they talk about it all the time. And then we know about the Mongols from external sources. And then we have this kind of little break in between. And the main sources that we have from that, we have a few institutional inscriptions, although a lot of them were destroyed in the earthquakes in the around 1500. But we also have a lot of funerary inscriptions. That's kind of the biggest group of things we have. Okay, so what did they look like? Who were the people buried there? And who was involved in writing them? And then how did they locate themselves in time and space, right? In the inscription, how do they use that to locate themselves? Okay. So first I'm going to go through a few different types of like inscriptions using photos that I've taken. Okay, so if you look at this inscription, what stands out to you? What do you notice? Yeah. The image of the Buddha?
Shape.
The shape, yeah.
Multilingual.
It's multilingual, yeah. Well, yeah. 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 Okay, so this is the tomb of a woman, Jalbi. So she's married to, so what we have here is the cartouche in the middle has her name. And then on the left, we've got, sorry, on the right, we've got the person who wrote it, which is a monk from Five Peaks Temple, or Datsa Temple in Five Peaks, which is in Dali, in Diancang area. And then on the other side, we've got the name of her husband, name of her son, and then information about the date and when it was set up. Yeah. And then we've got these. So this is the Sidong script around the top, which I found out yesterday probably is because they're in circles, they're meant to represent, each one is meant to represent a different Buddha or Bodhisattva. So this script it derives from Indic scripts, obviously, as you can probably tell from how it looks, but it fell out of use in India in like the 7th century CE, but remains used in religious contexts in East Asia, China, and especially Japan. Much later, yeah. And we've also got this lotus down at the bottom, you can see. Okay. So this has some similarities with the previous one, right? It's got the same Siddham script, but it's got a little, it's also, it's a lot, well, what, if you look at this, what do you notice the differences from the previous one?
it's easier to recognize.
Yeah, the carving is much clearer. Yeah.
Yeah, there's no blue figure on it, other than the cedar screens.
Yeah.
The cartouche is on the fan part, not on the
Yep.
stem part.
Yeah. And it's much, well, it's about the same length. It doesn't have the same, so the previous one had, so in the cartouche it says, it's the Shindao right down the
Right,
bottom.
right.
And this one, it's Shotang, right?
Mm.
So it's, a tomb prepared before death. Yeah. And the other thing that's different about this one is that we've got writing on the back as well, which the other one does not have. It actually has an image of a Buddha up above this part on the back. And then this script is some form of Devanagari or a Nagari script, right? So it's writing, it is, I think, mantras in Sanskrit. Yeah. But what it has on the front in the stem part instead of the cartouche is like a full a kind of normal or typical sort of Chinese language literary Chinese funerary inscription account of this person's life. So it's got some of the material, some of the features of the other one, but it's also got a longer kind of funerary inscription, which is what we're going to look at next. Okay, so this one is from 1529, so it's a little bit later than the main ones I wanted to talk about, but I've got pictures of both the original and the rubbing, so I thought it would be a good one to include. What do you notice about this inscription?
It's quite long.
It's quite long, yep.
Broken.
Yep, it's been broken and reconstructed for sure. You can see it in the here as well.
Mm.
You can match them.
The border's quite unusual.
Yeah, it's got this interesting border around the edges.
Is there anything on the other side?
Not on this, but some do. Yeah.
So in that case, it doesn't have any tutorial.
No.
elements,
Yeah,
or it doesn't have the Siddham script and so forth.
it doesn't have Siddham script. It did have some kind of header.
Oh, did it?
We know this because the inscription or so the first part of the inscription is the people who compiled it, right? We've got someone who wrote composed the text. We've got someone who copied it out, and we've got someone who did the seal script. There's no seal script.
seal script there, so
So, yeah.
it must have been on top.
Yeah. And there are other ones that have like a sand check header that doesn't go over the edges like this. And that has the seal script up there. Okay. Okay, and this Mr. Zhang, he died in office in Sichuan and then was brought back to his hometown for burial. He was from Dali originally. And so the inscription includes information about how that happened.
Right, name. Beautiful. I like that.
Okay, so this one is the most sort of standard Mujaming shape, right? The Mugbe is the more common in the texts that I have, at least in this period, but we do have some of these Mujaming. So Li Yuanyang is a guy who was responsible for compiling gazetteers in the middle of the 17th century, and he also is the copyist for this one. Okay, so what do you notice about this one?
Is that's inaccurate? Like it's lost the rest of it.
It's lost.
It's broken.
Yeah.
The calligraphy is a different style.
Hmm,
And then what's the difference between Mujaming and Mugbe?
the shape. I mean, yeah, primarily, right? So Bei implies this kind of vertical thing, and this is you can see it does it, so it's missing parts, but it's not missing like that much, yeah.
That was its location in the tomb.
And also the location in the tomb, so the Mujiming are entombed. Yeah. Sealed up. Yeah, and so this has got the seal script that the other one doesn't have.
Can I just
Hmm?
ask, prior to I mean, how far back does Chinese script go in the Dali region? I mean, was the Nanjiao and all that, were they writing in Chinese?
So the oldest stone inscription we have is the Nanjiao stele, the Wuhua stele, which is from the other day, but it's towards the end of the Nanjiao kingdom, and it commemorates a switch in allegiance. So at that time, so the Nanjiao is this smallish kingdom, and there's the Tang on one side and Tibet on the other, and they're both very powerful. And the Nanjiao would switch back and forth depending on what they needed, right? And who was going to give them the better deal at whatever time. And so this Nanjiao, the Wuhua stele, commemorates a particular change in allegiance from Tibet to the Tang.
So what, I mean, linguistically,
Yeah.
the people who lived there,
Yeah.
what did they speak back then? Did they write it?
So they spoke, we think it was a Tibetan Burman language,
Okay.
of some kind. So the linguistic evidence suggests that Bai, as it is spoken now, is a kind of contact language with a Tibeto-Burman substrate, but also spoken by a population that's been bilingual in some form of Chinese, or so the form of Chinese is sort of Nanjing Guanghua. For like several centuries, for a long time. We don't know exactly how long, but based on the historical evidence, you would guess from sometime either from the 18th century when we had the really large wave of migration, or from the earlier period when we have like a smaller wave of migration.
So
From the 14th century.
I suppose what I'm asking
Yeah.
is the people who were writing these
Yeah.
in literary Chinese,
Yeah.
what were they talking at home?
That's a good question. So we don't obviously know for sure. I think some of them would have been speaking some Tibeto-Burman language at home. Some of them, so we have some written texts in like poems or songs from this period that produce like use Hanzi to write this other language, by whatever you want to call it. So we know that happened. So which is the kind of thing that you find in like Vietnam or something, right? Where you write the spoken language is in Chinese, but you can use Hanzi to write it.
Right. And so this would be a bit like people from Gaul writing in Latin, even though they spoke Gaulish at home, possibly.
So this is,
Yeah.
Also, the orthography, I mean, you've got the calligraphy here, and the seal, and the Devanagari, and the Siddham, all written quite nicely. So in other words, the craftsmen, at least, are quite proficient in writing across.
Yeah.
Well, they're probably different craftsmen from what Eloise said about that inscription, that one person did the Haishu and one person did the Li.
But there was the Nagari and the Hanzi
Yeah.
right next to each other, and both were written quite nicely.
So they might have been different people. So
Well,
Right.
there's an additional, so at the beginning, let me just skip ahead. So at the beginning, we talk about the composers, right? So at the first half, when I said there was the person who composed it, the person who copied it, and the person who wrote the seal script, at the end, with the sponsors, we have the person who carved it, right? So there's a clear, they're not the same group of people at all. The carvers are clearly not, I would assume it's some kind of class or status differentiation, right? The carvers are not educated in the same way that the people who, they're obviously skilled, right? But they're not also writing that thing initially, yeah. Okay. Okay, so a number of these inscriptions come from, so most of these inscriptions are currently held by the Dali City Museum, right, the courtyard with the steles, which is in the old city here. But a large number of them come from a graveyard in Shizhou, Shizhou is here, and the graveyard's in the mountains there. So this is looking north from in the mountains, and Dali City is like this, all these buildings here. And then you can see in the lake, there's a little peninsula. And Shizhou is just sort of on the inland part of the peninsula. And the inscriptions, many of them, not all, come from Honggui cemetery, which is in the foothills a little bit. That is not a picture of Honggui cemetery. That is a picture of where Du and Chiu is buried, which is in a similar part of, it's like in the foothills in the same kind of way, but instead of being behind Shizhou, it's behind Dali City itself. Okay. Name of string, Honggui is also the string. So it's in use from the 14th. So the earliest inscriptions we have are from the 14th century. It was destroyed sometime in the middle of the 20th century, but not before. So in the 1930s and 40s, when all the universities were moved down to Kunming, a lot of the scholars who were there were like, well, what can we study? And one of the things they did was go to Dali and collect like historical materials of various kinds. Including, they made a lot of rubbings of the inscriptions in the Honggui cemetery. So we have some of them. So some of them, like this one, we have the actual stele was moved to the city museum, but a lot of them have been destroyed, and so we just have the rubbings that were made at that time in the 40s. Okay. So we have, as you could have picked up from the discussion about who carved them, we have like a bunch of different people involved in these producing these texts. So in terms of who made the steles and who was buried there, there's overlap, but it's not identical groups of people. So most of the tombs have individual men in them. Some of them have couples. Some of them have individual women, like the first one that we looked at. Most of them were born in Dali. So like the gentleman who died in Sichuan, they were either died there or moved back after death. There's a pretty small minority of monastics. There's also a few people who are buried who took some kind of vows late in life after marrying and having children as well. But there's a small number who are known primarily by monastic names. Often the inscriptions identify them as being from prominent families, but they may or may not have like degrees or like be official families, right? Involving either official service or military service under the Ming. There are mixed attitudes toward the Ming conquest. So we have one couple who, in protest to the Ming conquest, died by suicide. We have other people who withdrew from, a family that identifies itself as the Jiao Yangs. So more than 50% of the people have the family name Yang. So not by any means all, but like a lot. And so they differentiate themselves by different paronyms or by referencing one voice. They differentiate themselves as the Jiao Yangs. Jiao was a lower level official title under the Mongols. And so this branch of the family identifies themselves through an ancestor who held that position. And so one of his descendants in like the fourth generation, we have one family who withdrew from official service after the Ming conquest. And then we have another branch of the family that did take official service in roughly the same time period. And there's some overlap between the people who were buried there and the people who composed the inscriptions, right? So the Yuan Yang we saw copied the inscription and then also was buried there. One of the other men involved in copying this inscription. So the person who composed this inscription, Yang Shiyun, is the nephew or great nephew of Yang Sen, who composed not this one, but a number of these earlier ones, and is also buried in there as well. So there's a kind of, it seems like the people who wrote the inscriptions were mostly of the same social group as the people who were buried there. Contrasted with the carvers. So in terms of the people who made the steles, they're all men as far as I can tell. In the very earliest inscriptions, many of them appear only once. So for example, we have a couple of people of Mongol origin who we have inscriptions for, and the people who carved those inscriptions didn't carve any other inscriptions, aren't buried there. We don't have a lot of information connecting them to other inscriptions or to other, or even any other information about them. There's compared to the proportion of people who were monastics, there's more of them, there's a larger proportion involved in producing them than actually buried there, which suggests that maybe wealthy families who had a monastic connection would use that, would draw on that, right, to get someone who was locally respected to write their inscription. And so that was a form of prestige that would encourage that. There aren't very many officials from elsewhere, which is a big contrast with like institutional inscriptions, right? So inscriptions in schools or like water things, or even temples often will have someone from somewhere else write the inscription. But the funerary inscriptions don't have that generally. As we get later, they often have degrees. So when you're giving the name, you also give all the titles and all the as many titles as they have, you give them, right? And quite often that includes a degree. And carvers again. And in contrast to some funerary inscriptions, the children don't write them typically, although they are mentioned at the end as having sponsored them. And sometimes in the inscription, there's a narrative about someone going to like request someone to write the inscription, but they infrequently write it themselves. Okay. So in terms of the genre of these kinds of inscriptions, we talk about like tropes or topoi that are not all necessary, but often recur. Within this broader kind of frame. So the frame, this one, so okay, that was in the wrong order. So the frame, basically all of these are, they're not all necessary, but most inscriptions have all of them. So you can occasionally leave one out, but people don't often. So there's a title. There's this information about who composed it and created it. There's a preface, which is like an extended narrative, prose narrative. There's an elegy, right, in a poem at the end, which basically repeats the same themes as the preface in a really condensed form. There's information about the sponsors and possibly a carver, and there's a date. Okay, within the preface, we have a number of tropes that are like, they're more flexible than the overall frame, right? The frame of the inscription is pretty set. The tropes come or go and they can be moved around, but they typically appear in this order. So there will be an occasion of a composition, which could be such and such a son came and asked me to write an inscription for their recently deceased parents. There's an identification of the tomb occupant by name and place of birth. These two can switch. So quite often the first sentence will be the identifying the person, but sometimes it will appear after the occasion of composition, and occasionally it will appear after their ancestry. Okay, so the ancestry can be, you know, in these 2 generations previous, here are the achievements of this person's father or grandfather. It can also be, here's a list of all the ancestors back to the Nanjiao. Or it can also be, here's their most illustrious ancestor and here's what they did. That's all I'm going to tell you, right? Okay, the childhood usually explains, you know, how the achievements of their later career are foreshadowed in how diligent they were as a child. This is probably the least common one to be included, like it's quite often left out, and it's usually pretty short. Something about whatever they did with their life, which could be, well, we'll see a few examples later. Marriage and children, who their children married, who their grandchildren are, any additional information like that. And then at the end, there are sometimes a kind of generic reflection on the virtue of the, or not specifically the virtue of the person who is entombed there, but what this says generally, what kind of moral one could draw from their life. Yeah. Okay, so I have 3 examples, all from the kind of early 15th century. So this one is composed by Yangsen that I mentioned. It's a couple, it's from that Jiao family that I mentioned. And it does, this was unusual, it has someone who's an official involved in producing it, but I am not sure where he was from originally. Okay. So Yang Zhongying, his acquired surname was Yang, originally from Hongnong, which is surely distant. I'm not sure about that translation. That ancestor had official position and virtue, which he passed to his descendants and eventually filled the whole ruling, Tianxia. But I cannot write superfluous details. The one who came to Dali was Xilian, according to his genealogy, who formerly served, this is bits unclear, the local lord of the Ming clan, the Guiyi king. So this is a title of the Nanjiao ruler King Orge. He took a debut name Shengming and became the Bubian, which is a Nanjiao title, which is usually rendered as Grand Counselor. His 5th generation descendant Zhang began as a Jiao in Dali's circuit, was promoted to magistrate of Wuding Circuit of Jinsha Commandery, that's in Western Yunnan, and deputy prefect of Chengchong Prefecture, also in Western Yunnan. Zhang gave birth to Man, who started as Jiancheng Circuit Magistrate. Man gave birth to Hai, who was a plain man and honest and sincere. The person, Yang Zhongying, is the grandson of Hai. So what I wanted to bring out here is, firstly, what are the people, what are the time periods that they think are important to mention, right? The Ming clan, the Nanjiao, and then the skips to the Yuan. So there's nothing from the Dali kingdom that's not mentioned at all, nothing from the intervening small kingdoms. So the Nanjiao clearly have some kind of cachet or some kind of significance to, even in the Ming dynasty, to these, even after the Mongol conquest, after the Ming conquest, the Nanjiao is still some kind of focus, right? It's relevant, it's something that people would recognize, right? They don't say Nanjiao, they just say the name of the king and the name of the ruling clan or the title of the king, and expect you to know what it means, right? Hongnong is interesting, right? So Hongnong, does anyone recognize that? So it's a tongue. Okay, there's 2 young Hongnongs. There's a king. There's a duke young of Hongnong, I think. And then there's also Hongnong as a region, which is just western Shanxi, I think, in the Tang dynasty. And there was a famous young clan from there. So whether or not and so they were known as like the Yanzi of Hongnong, that was like a thing. whether someone with connection of there came to Yunnan, and so that's why they identify as this person having come to, as being part of this overall clan, or whether it's something that's kind of lost its close connection, and it just means, you know, we know there's a famous young of Hungnung, so we'll use Hungnung. It's not clear. Okay. And so the 3 pagodas are from the Nanjiao period as well, and were rebuilt after the earthquakes in the Ming. Okay, so this one is one of the ones that are composed by some kind of ritual specialist. The tomb is Mr. Li, and I've got here the first line of the preface and the first 2 lines of the elegy because they repeat each other. So Mr. Li's courtesy name was Zijing, and his given name was Mu. He was from that city on the Honggui River in Dali. So he was from, okay, and then it says, born in the historical city, he was loyal and filial. His whole life he cultivated himself and he carefully strengthened himself. So the historical city and the city on Honggui River both refer to Shizhou, right? So that's, again, we're, yeah, looking at this place, and you can see in the map that there are little rivers going down the mountain, right? So there's famously like 19 of them, I think. And so the Honggui River is, I guess, the one, or it's not the name of the stream that you find in the 16th century gazetteers, but so I assume that then it must have been an alternative name used in this period for this place. Okay. So what I wanted to highlight here is the use of the physical markers, right? So instead of identifying the kind of identifying with historical people or places, it's identifying with the immediate physical surroundings. Okay, seal script is by Yang Sen again. Okay, in this case, so the deceased name is, tribute name is Sheng, by courtesy Yi Zhi. He was a local Ming man from Taihe. So Taihe is the town that's a little bit south of Dali City, which was the capital of the Nanjiao Kingdom. So this is combining, right, the identification of the place and the identification of the historical figures, right, the Meng clan. But they're using the Meng clan as the way to identify the place. His grandfather was a great artist, which is another, it's a transcription of a Sanskrit term. Some dispute about which Sanskrit term exactly, but it's a title that's used for a Buddhist, like senior Buddhists in Dali. He was proficient in esoteric teachings and was a monastic official during the Meng times. His grandfather's tribute name was Yan, his father's Bao. So we have a timeline problem here, right? So the Meng times are, like, it's not possible for this person, this thing's from 1420, it's not possible for the grandfather to have been been alive during the Nanjiao period. So there's a question mark about what exactly they're referring to. And then at the end of the elegy, we have a passage that ties again the gravesite to the process of the process by which the inscription was compiled. So he divined his gravesite on the south side of Honggui. Again, the soil is moist and the 4 views are clear. So the 4 views, this kind of trope of describing the gravesite by reference to 4 views is something that a recent dissertation by Yang Yi studied Tang, excavated epitaphs from parts of Shanxi and then a bit from Zhejiang, and she found that in 2 of the specific locations, they used a 4 views framework to situate the tombs within particular local landmarks, right? So mountains and rivers that were specifically significant in that time and that place. And so they seem to be using this trope again, right? But in this case, in Dali and not in Xinjiang or Shanxi. Okay, so to sum up, the geographical touchstones that we can see in these inscriptions include both Honggui itself, right, the cemetery and its immediate surroundings, views around the cemetery, and then human settlements, right, Dali and Xizhou, and Taiyao. And the historical touchstones are primarily the Nanjiao, a little bit the Mongols, and a little bit the Ming conquest, not in the ones that I showed today, but in a number of the others they reference, particularly for the people for whom the Ming conquest was in living memory. They discuss, or they locate them, it's important to locate themselves in relation to this immediately stating historical event. So what does this mean in the context of the larger questions about Dali identity? So one of the ways that we often talk about it, this sort of change in the 16th century, right, is this increase of interest in the Nanjiao, in the pre-Mongol history of Dali. And so what I think these inscriptions show us is that this kind of connection to the Nanjiao as a kind of local history, as a trope of local history, had previously existed in sort of family contexts, right? In the funerary inscriptions of individuals trying to locate themselves within a lineage of people from Dali. And the sort of broadening that we get in the 16th century that kind of incorporates Dali society as a whole is drawing on a pre-existing set of tropes that had, including some of the people who were writing those ones, had been drawing on for over a century before that in more specific contexts. Thank you.